Hello friends, this is the JOOLA 3S. These paddles all have JOOLA's newest take on their propulsion core technology, and I think these are some of JOOLA's best paddles yet. However, they've only been approved by the UPA-A, which means you can't use them at USAP sanctioned tournaments. Let's get into it. So first, a disclosure. JOOLA sent me these paddles to test for a potential review with no obligations. No money changed hands, and JOOLA did not have any input on this video's production or get to preview it before it was published. But if you use one of my affiliate codes to purchase one of these paddles, I get a commission, which helps this channel and allows me to keep making videos like this.
I saw him picking apples from the tree. He asked me, would you like to be a caterpillar on the leaf? I answered in the shell, I'd rather be a worm, hiding in the soil, doing all the dirty work. He looked with funny eyes, as if to his surprise, I get paralyzed.
Okay, I don't want to get into too many details about how the 3S paddles came to be, and by now, most everyone knows that JOOLA's original Gen 3s, which introduced their propulsion core, were delisted earlier this year by USAP on a technicality relating to similarity testing. Then there was a lawsuit and the release of the mod TA-15 that had already been approved by the USAP, which is the exact same paddle as the Gen 3s. And now they've released the new 3S paddles under an entirely different governing body, the UPA-A. So, are the 3Ss any different than the original Gen 3s, which are now effectively banned? It turns out, yes, they are, and I'll get into the reasons why in a minute. The 3S paddles sold out shortly after they were released 3 weeks ago, but they've just been restocked and you can get them directly from JOOLA at their website for $280, which is the same price as their previous Gen 3s and their mod TA-15. There are 4 models for the 3S, the Perseus, Scorpius, Magnus, and Hyperion. And each of these comes in 16mm and 14mm varieties. And all of these variances are associated with various JOOLA pros, so Ben Johns, Anna Bright, Tyson McGuffin, Colin Johns, and Simone Jardine. These shapes range from elongated to standard, from square to the arrow curve shape, and with long to short handles. In this video, I'm going to talk mostly about the Perseus and the Scorpius. If you're interested in the Magnus or the Hyperion, you can assume that these two models will play similar to the Perseus, but the Magnus will have a shorter handle and the Hyperion will have a lighter swing weight. Based on separate conversations that Chris Olsen and I had with JOOLA, we now know more details about how the 3Ss were designed and manufactured and how they differ from the original Gen 3s and the mod TA-15. If you want the details, go check out mine or Pickleball Studios podcast from last week. The short of it is that the original Gen 3 cores were compressed, meaning that the polypropylene was cut a little thicker than the mold, so that when it was put into the mold, the core was squished a little bit under heat and pressure, which made it springier and more powerful. It's probably also why there were several reports that the Gen 3s were breaking, since they were core crushed by design. The mod TA-15 also has this compressed core, but the new 3Ss do not. This makes them less powerful, but also probably more durable and less prone to break. I've dissected the original Gen 3 Perseus and the mod TA-15, and they both look the same. Like most thermoformed paddle, they have a layer of perimeter foam, but what makes them different is that they have another layer of softer white foam between the polypropylene core and the top and sides of the paddle. I recently started using X-rays as a more non-invasive method to examine the cores. Here are the X-rays of the Gen 3 paddles compared to the new 3Ss. Initially, they look pretty much the same. They both have edge foam and the thickness of the interior foam looks the same. But if you look a little closer at the polypropylene, the differences start to emerge. In the X-ray, you can see crushed cells on the Gen 3 models. Healthy cells are circular or octagonal, but the crushed cells have a star shape with concave walls that collapse inward due to the pressure of the surrounding cells. As a point of comparison, here's a non-thermoformed paddle with very healthy cells. It's a Paddletech Bantam TKO CX, and you can see all of the cells are almost completely circular. Most thermoformed paddles with edge foam have crushed cells right next to the foam due to the pressure of the expanding foam. That won't normally be a problem because you're not hitting the ball there. But crushed core cells in the center of the paddle face could be a problem because they've lost their structural integrity and could potentially infect the cells next to them after a ball hits this area hundreds of times, causing a crushed cell wall to spread outwards. After coloring them in, you can see there are 20 crushed cells in my Scorpius Gen 3. This paddle has only a few hours of playtime, so it's probably not from use. And by the way, I'm excluding crushed cells in the first 2 rows adjacent to the edge foam. Compare this to the Scorpius 3S, which has no crushed cells. The Perseus Gen 3 is even worse. It had 35 crushed cells, and it had even less playtime than the Scorpius, so it probably came from the factory this way because of the compression. And again, let's compare this to the Perseus 3S. You can see far fewer crushed cells, 3 in total, all near the interface with the foam. So these x-rays give me much more confidence that the JOOLA 3S paddles will be more durable than their predecessors. There still might be a possibility that because the propulsion core foam extends further into the face of the paddle than many other paddle options out there with edge foam, that crushed cells could spread from this area into the interior. But after looking at these x-rays, I'd definitely trust the 3S to last longer than a Gen 3 or a Mod TA15. So I'm going to jump to the chase here, and then we'll dive into the numbers in a little more detail. The 3S models all are more muted than the original Gen 3s and the Mod TA15. So in terms of firepower, the Gen 3s and the Mod are all around 95 to 96, and the 3S models are just under 90. To compare these numbers to other paddles, the Gen 3s and the Mod fall in the same range as the Gearbox Pro Power in terms of firepower, and the 3Ss are more comparable to the Paddletech Bantams. If you're not familiar with how I'm getting these numbers, I'm measuring power and pop with a Stalker 3S radar gun and translating those raw numbers to percentiles to see how the paddles compare to over 200 others in my database. So with a score of 90 for firepower, the JOOLA 3Ss are still very much power paddles, but they fall slightly below the most powerful paddles. Here's what all of the performance metric percentiles look for the Perseus and Scorpius 3S paddles. We're looking at power, pop, spin, swing weight, twist weight, and balance point. High values over on the left side of the chart indicate more firepower, and high values on the top right of the chart relate to the paddle's control and forgiveness. Lastly, the bottom of the chart tells you about maneuverability and hand speed. By the way, these radar charts are available for nearly every paddle in my database, so head on over to johnqpickleball.com or follow the link in the description to check that out yourself. What we see here is that both paddles have a good amount of power and pop, but the Perseus edges out the Scorpius for power, which means shots with full swings like serves and drives. But the Scorpius edges out the Perseus in pop, which involves shorter swing paths like punch volleys, counters, and flicks at the kitchen. Both paddles get good spin, and the difference we're seeing here between the Perseus and the Scorpius is probably just random and doesn't indicate any fundamental difference in spin between these models. But the remaining indices really capture the primary differences between the Perseus and Scorpius. The Perseus has a higher swing weight and balance point, meaning it's less maneuverable, but it gets more leverage and plow through, which contributes to its higher power scores. And the Scorpius has a higher twist weight, which reflects a wider sweet spot and a more forgiving paddle that requires less precision than the Perseus. So overall, the Perseus provides a bit more power with fuller swings, but its sweet spot is more narrow. And the Scorpius has a wider sweet spot, and it's overall more control-oriented, but it also provides plenty of pop at the kitchen for offensive options. As the performance metrics suggest, when playing with the 3S models side by side with the original Gen 3s and the mod TA15, there's a noticeable difference in firepower. The 3S models are all detuned and they don't hit as hard as the Gen 3s and the mod. Still, the 3Ss fall squarely in the power category. So if you've played with one of the original Gen 3s or the mod, imagine playing with a slightly more muted, stiffer version of that paddle, and you have the 3S. The 3Ss also have a slightly deeper, thuddy tone when you hit the ball compared to most other paddles out there, which is an effect of foam in the core, similar to the Gen 3s, but not quite as deep. The increased stiffness of the paddle face translates to slightly less dwell time than the Gen 3s, so the 3S models feel more paddle-like and less like a tennis racket. The 3S models all have very good sweet spots, although the stiffness makes the sweet spot feel just a little smaller than the Gen 3s. Still, I'd say that the sweet spots are above average compared to most paddles on the market right now. My personal favorite among these paddles is the Scorpius shape, which I think has a good balance between power and control, and the wider sweet spot is more forgiving than the elongated shapes. I'm still on the fence between the 16mm Colin Johns and the 14mm Anna Bright. The Colin is softer and feels more forgiving, but the Anna has more pop and offensive options. If you prefer elongated shapes, the Perseus, Hyperion, and Magnus are your choices. The Perseus will probably be the most popular of these three and sits in the middle in terms of versatility. The Hyperion is a little quicker in the hands with its arrow curve shape, and the Magnus is for people who want a shorter handle and who don't use two-handed shots. I do think all of these paddles benefit from some weighting modifications, especially the thinner 14mm versions. Personally, I prefer 3-gram strips of tungsten tape extending up the shoulders and lower edges of the 16mm versions, and double that for the 14mm versions. This weighting gives the paddles a bit more plow through, it widens the sweet spot, and it makes them overall more forgiving. My reviews of the original JOOLA Gen 3s and the mod TA15 were cautiously optimistic. They had many perks, but there were some issues with them becoming too powerful and even breakage. But I think the new 3S models are JOOLA's best option to date. And I'd easily recommend these to people who are willing to pay a premium price for a power paddle, with just a couple of caveats that I'll discuss in just a minute. When JOOLA released their Gen 3 paddles earlier this year, they were a big success, but they were quickly delisted by the USAP based on some technicalities, and JOOLA offered full refunds for tens of thousands of units. But even between that short period between the release and the delisting, there were a lot of reports of people breaking their paddles, especially heavy hitters. In fact, my own Scorpius 3 broke. The way you can tell it's broke is that it starts hitting uncontrollably hard and it crunches when you press your thumbs into the face. And now we know what's probably the main reason for this breakage. The cores were being compressed during the thermoforming process, which created more powerful paddles, but also probably compromised the integrity of the honeycomb cells within the core. The cores in the 3S models are no longer compressed, and for the most part, it appears that these cells are no longer crushed, as revealed in my X-ray images. This creates less powerful paddles, but they're also less likely to break. And honestly, the Gen 3s and mod paddles were probably too powerful for the game, especially after they broke in. Speaking of break-in, the 3S models also have a break-in period when they loosen up and become slightly hotter. I've noticed this on my Scorpius, which now has about 12 hours of playtime, but it's still less powerful than a new Gen 3 or a mod. I don't know where the break-in will stop yet, but JOOLA told me their goal for the 3S models after they're fully broken in is to not exceed the power of a brand new Gen 3. All of this is to say that I think the 3S is an improvement over the Gen 3s and the mod. It strikes a better balance between power and control, and the way it's made gives me more confidence that it'll be more durable. As I mentioned earlier, there still is a chance that the 3Ss will break due to the nature of the propulsion core, which causes the polypropylene core to flex more near the interface with the foam boundary. And in theory, there's the potential for crushed cells near the foam to spread down into the face of the paddle. Time will tell, but like I said, the 3S cores are not compressed, so I suspect they will be more durable. And JOOLA does have a 6-month warranty against defects. And the last thing you should consider when you're thinking about buying one of the 3S paddles is that they're only certified by the UPA-A. So you will be able to play with the 3Ss at PPA events, but not at USAP sanctioned tournaments. For example, at APP events. Most local tournaments are not USAP sanctioned, and they're not likely to ban the 3S paddles at these types of events. USAP sanctioned tournaments make up about 10% of all events, so this probably won't be that big of a deal for most people, even if they are active in tournaments. If you do decide to pick up one of these paddles, please consider using one of my affiliate links in the description. JOOLA doesn't offer discounts on the 3Ss, but using my affiliate link doesn't cost you anything, and it provides me with a kickback. Okay, who knew I'd review so many JOOLA paddles this year? Hopefully these are their last release of the year, which wouldn't be a bad thing since they are, in my opinion, their best offering to date, and it's always good to end on a high note. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.